All right, so not all the Psalms are obviously about David or by David, but I don't think it's a stretch to say the majority of them are, because as we noticed in this lesson, while there may be some Psalms without superscription at all, which remember in earlier lessons we talked about those inscriptions, some are superscriptions that come before the Psalm, and some of those actually are probably, when it gives musical instruction, that's probably actually a subscription, which is supposed to come at the end of the last Psalm, the previous Psalm. But when there's not a superscription that says a Psalm of David, and it's just a Psalm, it's very possible that it was still a Psalm of David that was written, and there are even Psalms of David that don't have that superscription that are attributed to David by the Holy Spirit in the New Testament. And so, in reading those, knowing David's life and the things that he faced, it's pretty easy to see some of those that aren't directly attributed, that they probably are his. So we're going to look at Psalms relating to David's life today, and like I said, we'll continue that on Wednesday, Lord willing. So David's life covers quite a bit of the Old Testament section there. And where do we read about his life and his rule as king? 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then over in 1st Chronicles as well, which is a book of history that kind of dates around where we would have the things happening with Ezra and Nehemiah, the return from captivity and such, but it's a historical record of Israel. And so you have a lot of the same things mentioned, some details mentioned, some things that are mentioned there that aren't mentioned in 1st, 2nd Samuel, but essentially 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st Chronicles. I hope that you read through that. That's a long read. If you haven't, I would encourage you to do so. And even if you don't get to it before Wednesday, I would just encourage you to do that, because it really gives us some insight into, obviously, who David is, but also helps us to comprehend the psalmist's background, as many of them are written by him, which is really what this is about. Over in Lesson 5, Tyler took us through some of the historical background to the Psalms, which ranges from the creation of the universe all the way to captivity and return. And so that's in the background of it. Anytime you have some kind of art, like poetry, or even imagery, and even now, the cinema, the art that's in cinema and such, it's easier to understand where that person who composed that art was coming from, and why it looks the way it does, or why he said the things that he said, with the historical background to it. And that really goes without saying, but I think it's extremely important, and that's the case with anything we study in the entirety of the Bible. If you just jump into the book and you haven't laid some groundwork by maybe reading the book, just a cursory reading from front to back first, and gleaning some of those internal evidences, or maybe like with the epistles, reading the section that pertains to that particular city or church or situation first, and considering that, or even consulting some extra biblical resources of culture or language or history or whatever it may be, and then getting into that book, you're not going to be able to understand it and glean from it near as much as you would as if you laid that groundwork. And I think it's the same thing with the Psalms. There are times in the Psalms where you may be reading through the psalmist like David, talking about how innocent he is and just how righteous he is. And you might think, who has the audacity to say that? Who has that kind of confidence? And why would he say that? And then we read about how unfairly he's being treated. He's done nothing wrong, and people are trying to murder him, and it kind of gives us a better understanding of that. Wouldn't you kind of think that way about yourself if you were following God faithfully? As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, I don't know of anything against myself, and yet these people are treating me like an evildoer, and wouldn't you appeal to that? God, I've been faithful to you. And then even times he says, if I haven't and I don't know it, show me. I want to be faithful to you. So if I'm deserving of this, let me know what I need to do to fix what I've done wrong and all that kind of stuff. So the history of it is so important, and we saw that in general in Lesson 5. And since many of the Psalms are written by David or about David, then it certainly is helpful to study David's life and think about the things that he went through. And so along those lines, we see it with the information in the superscriptions. A psalm of David may mean a psalm that David wrote, certainly about himself, or just a psalm someone wrote about David. But for our lesson, there's no guesswork on that. We're just assuming that it's not just about David, but these are psalms that David wrote as well. And certainly many of them speak of this kind of first-person intimacy of knowledge with the particular period it refers to. So first, let's think about David's life a little bit, and especially some of the examples that are mentioned here. He says there on page 32, as we had just recently studied Psalm 23, that was the shepherd psalm, that, that can be further understood and appreciated with the knowledge that David himself was a shepherd. Turn to 1 Samuel 16. 1 Samuel 16. Remember, Samuel is sent to whose house as he's seeking the man who would replace Saul? Jesse's house. Bethlehemite of Judah. He has several sons, doesn't he? And who is it that's chosen? Well, it's David, isn't it? Notice in someone read verse 11 of 1 Samuel 16, after he had looked at all of his brothers. First Samuel 16, and in verse 11. So what was he doing at the very moment? I mean, kind of shows the way men think in contrast to the way God thinks, because he wasn't even there. All his brothers are there, and he's just doing his duties. What was he doing? He's tending sheep. In chapter 17, what do we read about with David? What significant event occurs? You remember? Goliath. So the Philistines come out against the Israelites. And they're in this area, and they send out Goliath, the champion, who's this giant, and he challenges them, is there anyone who can take me on, basically. And they're all scared, aren't they? And David shows up, and David has this confidence about him. This is where he says, is there not a cause? The brothers of his are embittered toward him, thinking that he had some other reasons for coming of a selfish nature. And he said, isn't there a cause? He's defying the God of Israel. He's defying our God. How dare he do that? So David is obviously in a very young age already full of this spiritual mindset and righteousness and faith in God and righteous indignation, and not just that is without movement, but that is purposeful and is going to get things done. Someone read verse 34 through 36, because it kind of shows his confidence relating to his experience as a shepherd already. 34 to 36 of chapter 17. So I don't know how that occurred. Did David see the lion and the bear and just without hesitation go to it? Did he sit down and pray first? Did God tell him before that, listen, I'm going to pick you to lead my people. You're my guy, and so I'm with you from here on out, and you're going to have this extra power or whatever happened. But obviously he's brave. He cares for his sheep. to the extent that he's willing to fight a lion and a bear. Now, he couldn't do that without God, and that's his point. But what interests me with that is back in chapter 16, when Saul has this distressing spirit, and someone says, that David of Jesse's household, he's really good at, playing the instrument, the harp. Go get him and he'll soothe you with his music. In verse 11, this is what he says about him of verse 18, of chapter 16. One of the servants of Saul that is answered and said, "Look, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing and mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him." That really interests me because in chapter 17, when David said, "I'll fight him," what did Saul the king say about him? Who are you? You're just a little shepherd boy. And his armor was too big for him. But here his servant said he's a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech. And I think that refers to what would have probably been, at least to some degree, public knowledge that this shepherd boy has taken on a lion and a bear. He's in training, essentially, to be a great man of valor and war. And that came from his love for his sheep, his willingness as a shepherd to protect his sheep. What significance would that play later on as he was a shepherd in his life? What other part of his life would it be applied to? Yeah, he's a king shepherd. He was anointed king over Judah, and made king over Judah. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, was still reigning in Israel for some time. And then he dies, and Israel comes to David, and it says, indeed, in 2 Samuel 5, "We are your bone and your flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel." And so it's significant that he was a shepherd, not just because he was a shepherd, but because of what that helped him to learn, and how that helped him to view things, and what that did to equip him to be in such a position as a king, a leader, a protector, a provider, and God chose a lowly shepherd to be king over his people. So we learn that about David. But also we learn back in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel that he is a musician and a psalmist. It was Saul that got a distressing spirit from the Lord when he had sinned against God, and the Spirit of the Lord departed from him. And so to soothe his spirit, his servant says, "You find a person to play you music." And David was evidently good enough where it was well known that he was a good psalmist and musician. And so he brought him in, and when Saul had a distressing spirit, it was David's job to play music to soothe him. And so by God's providence, he brings him in, and eventually David would have military success and the people's awareness about him that would lead to 2 Samuel 5, when Israel wanted him to be their king and submitted to his rule. Notice in 2 Samuel 1, we see him put this into practice in a way that is exhibiting leadership and spiritual instruction. 2 Samuel 1. So Saul dies in battle with the Philistines. And Jonathan does as well. And Jonathan and David, of course, loved each other. Their souls were knit together. They were very, very close. But what's interesting is that after that happens in 2 Samuel 1, when he finds out about it, in verse 17, it says, David lamented with this lamentation, not just over Jonathan, but over Saul and his son, and told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher, and it goes through verse 27, and in that it says, Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. And so he's speaking well of not just the man that he had confidence in and loved and certainly was righteous, but in this man who sought to kill him his entire life. So there's this leadership even in this, and he's utilizing his talents, of course, in that service to the Lord, but in leading these men and this kind of lamentation and worship before God. And so it continues to show his leadership and exhibits it throughout that. And God, of course, is using him in this to reveal his word to us that we see in the Psalms. In 2 Samuel 22, and we read from this in our study the last hour. This corresponds to Psalm 18. It's verbatim Psalm 18. But in Psalm 22, he reflects on the Lord's faithfulness and deliverance throughout his time as king. It says that he spoke the words of this song on the day that the Lord had delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So using his music again. But then notice in chapter 23, and this is something that is mentioned in the book, it says the latter passage on page 32, the latter passage speaks of the oracles of David, implying he was also a prophet, which is confirmed in Acts 2:30. Thus it will not be surprising when we find prophetic elements in some of the Psalms. In chapter 23, it says these are the last words of David. And as you go down through it, it manifests the fact that he is speaking of the covenant that God made with him and the seed that he would have sitting on the throne forever, as God promised him in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel. Notice verse 5. Although my house is not so with God, yet he has made me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For this is all my salvation and all my desire. Will he not make it increase? This is speaking of that messianic context of 2 Samuel, and that seed would dwell on his throne forever. So he's even a prophet among other things, and that comes out in his psalm as well. One thing I really wanted to focus on a little bit this morning, turn to 2 Samuel 6. 2 Samuel 6. And we might as well just read this. So 2 Samuel 6, someone read verses 16 through 19, and then someone read verse 20 through 23. Verse 20 through the end of the chapter, please. Thank you. The ark is a big deal, isn't it? It contains the tablets of the law, the rod that budded, manna, so on and so forth. On it is the cherubim of glory, and that's where God speaks to the children of Israel. The mercy seat on which the blood of the covenant is sprinkled for atonement on the Day of Atonement once a year. Hebrews 9 talks about that. Big deal, right? And we read more of it in the history of 1st and 2nd Kings as well. So it's a big deal. This represents God, His Word, His dwelling, His fellowship, and they're bringing it to Judah. This is where God's house is going to eventually be when Solomon builds the temple. This is the place of worship. This is the city of David. This is the city of Zion, where obviously it typifies the heavenly Zion. So big deal, the ark coming in. And what does David do? What does he lead the people in when the ark of God is coming into Jerusalem? Leads them in worship, doesn't he? 1 Chronicles 15 recounts that the entire chapter in greater detail, and it manifests the formality of this, the order of this, the preparation that went into this. And he designed a worship procession to follow the ark in. And the king of all people is right there leading it, and he's whirling about, and he's singing, and he's playing, and he's worshiping God, isn't he? How did his wife feel about that? Michael or Michal? What'd she think about seeing her husband do that? She's embarrassed. He was despised in her eyes, it says. And says that he shamelessly is uncovering himself in front of the people. Who is her dad? Remember? Saul. Saul gave her to David as wife, and the dowry was 100 foreskins of the Philistines. We just talked about that in our lesson as well. And it says in 1 Samuel that she loved him. But evidently, the man that she loved was that man of valor and victory and bravery, a man that would be royal, a man that would be leader and famous and above all the people, just a really stout and big man as far as his character and his leadership. And so what she does here, I think, is she manifests the spirit of her father. Saul was not a man after God's own heart. Remember in 1 Samuel, where Saul, in chapter 15, he fails to destroy the Amalekites, what Samuel said about him, when you were little in your own eyes, did God not make you king over this people? When you were little in your own eyes. So Saul was arrogant. Saul was prideful. He thought himself better than other people. He thought himself above the law. He thought himself above the Lord of all things as well. And so now she's seeing her husband, the king, humbly worshiping with all the rest of the people. And she despises him. And what's really powerful to me is notice what David says in verse 22 when he rebukes her for this. He says, first of all, God chose me to be here. Who am I to be, greater than worshiping him? But then he says in verse 22, I will be even more undignified than this and will be humble in my own sight. It reminds me of what the Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 when we read about the love of Christ compelling him and the other apostles to live for Christ, and especially to convince other men to live for him and to serve God acceptably. He said this in verse 13 of 2 Corinthians 5, if we are beside ourselves, it is for God. If we're of sound mind, it is for you. And so I really think people think we're crazy for doing what we do every single time we come together. There are people who think it is completely foolish and ridiculous that a group of people that are not musically trained or inclined, though some of us may be, but overall, a vast majority of Christians, they're not professional musicians or anything like that. Other than the words on the page, they don't really know what's going on. They just know the tune that they have been raised to know. And people think it is crazy that we come together and sing together. It's like one thing if you join a choir because that's your thing and people sit and listen to you sing, but everyone sings. And some people don't sing great. Other people sing really great, but they still sing. That's just foolish. That's unadvanced and simple. And, who would ever stoop to that level? I mean, who knowing how bad their voice is and how free from talent they are, would still sing in front of all these people? How undignified. That's kind of what Michael is saying. You're the king and you're doing this. He says, I'll be even more undignified. And his point is not that it is undignified. His point is not that it's foolish any more than the apostles were outside of their mind. But the point is that I'm serving God in humility, and this is where all the value lies. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm going to join into that. And what a lesson that is for us. There are Christians who don't sing, sadly. And it's because they're embarrassed to do it. Maybe they don't feel like they're talented enough. David puts them to shame. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely. It's a lesson in humility. God exalts the humble. And that's really what worship is all about, isn't it? We're coming together to celebrate how small and insignificant we are in the presence of the Creator of the universe. Notice over in Psalm 2, when it talks about how the rulers are plotting vain things to thwart God's will, and He's going to laugh at them and hold them in derision. It says there in verse 10, the psalmist is encouraging them to, instead of being against him, get on his side. Therefore be wise, O kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest He be angry, and you perish in the way when His wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in Him. Kiss the Son. There's this concept in worship that, it's kind of, the Hebrew language is idiomatic and such. The idea is kind of like a dog licking at the master's feet. It's this humility and love and dependence and appeal, and it's kind of degrading if you think about it at first. But the whole idea is reverence and humility and awe, that none of us are above. It's beneath none of us. That's what worship is. Pride would be completely squashed the world over if people would worship God faithfully. And that's why it's so important for us to worship. It's so important to sing to Him. And if it's uncomfortable for you, because it's not necessarily a natural thing for you to do, being raised in this kind of a society, how much more important is it to get out of our comfort zone and to fall before the Lord in that kind of humility and worship? I'll be even more undignified than this, David says. Don't discount worship. Don't discount singing. Sing loud, and sing it because your heart moves you to sing it, and you feel so grateful to be even called a child of God. That's extremely important. We learned that about David. Comments, questions on any of that? All right, so a Psalm of David, as we mentioned, it may be about him, maybe by him. A lot of times we see that it actually is by him. Psalm 110 is certainly his. As Mark 12, Jesus quotes it to the Pharisees and said that David wrote this. Psalm 16 and Acts 2, we see that, in Psalm 110 as well. David wrote it there in Acts chapter 2. That's mentioned. Psalm 32 is quoted by Paul in Romans chapter 4 as being written by David. And then Psalm 2, of course, in Acts chapter 4, it's written by David. On page 32, he gives us some thoughts for the value of seeing David's life. The great value in linking David's life to any psalm written by him or about him is that we can see, hear, and maybe feel the truths expressed coming alive in the life of a real person. And this is something we studied before when we think about the Psalms and Hebrew poetry and their construct and stuff, is that it takes a lot of abstract kind of thoughts and tries to make them very concrete. Tries to take feelings that we have and give pictures to them. And when there is historical backdrop to a psalm in specificity, like this is exactly what this psalm is about, and we'll see some of those, it gives us that much more of an ability to relate to some real-life examples, David being the one that we're looking to. So a lot of value in knowing David's history and his life and studying the Psalms that he wrote. Anything else about that? All right, so in this, we naturally have to study about some of the superscriptions that come before the Psalms, because we're going to see many times not only is it a Psalm of David, whether it's about David or by David, but also specific historical context. Some historical context in a general way, where he's fleeing from enemies or fleeing from Saul, but at what point in his fleeing from Saul, that kind of stuff. Sometimes very specific, exact, to nailing down the verses within 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel. And those give us a lot to think about and to study about and glean furthermore from the Psalms because of it. So I mentioned Psalm 3, a Psalm of David. when he fled from Absalom, his son. That happens in 2 Samuel 15. And we remember that he had done some pretty bad things and been sent away or ran away, and then he comes back, and David's convinced by Joab to show some mercy to bring him back, and then Absalom actually usurps the throne and pushes David out, and he's fleeing for his life. And so that's a psalm of refuge. We'll look at in more detail probably Wednesday at the end of the lesson. Psalm 7, a meditation of David, which he sang to the Lord concerning the words of Cush, a Benjamite. We'll look at that in a moment, but here is a psalm that speaks about persecution of David from one of his own countrymen, a Benjamite, which possibly is Saul, but Cush is this name that is not found other places. He's not mentioned again, and so we might not know exactly, specifically, which enemy is persecuting him, and that's referencing in the psalm, but we know it refers to that period of time when he's fleeing from Saul and he's having that kind of hardship. Psalm 18, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So that's kind of broad. We saw that in 2 Samuel 22. A psalm of David, Psalm 34, when he pretended madness before Abimelech. We read of that in 1 Samuel 21. Achish, the king of Gath, is called Abimelech there in Psalm 34. And so he flees to Gath for refuge, and there are some servants of Achish, the king of Gath, which is a Philistine city, who actually recognize him and say, "Isn't this the guy who the people of Judah were singing about? David has slain his 10,000s," in reference to the Philistines. Do we really want him around here? And so he grows afraid, and he plays a madman, and Achish says, "Why have you brought a madman to me? I have no use for him," and sent him out, and he escaped his enemies that day. Psalm 51, what's that psalm about? That's a very familiar psalm. Say it again. Yeah, Nathan came to David, and he said, "You are the man." What did David do? What was the parable about? Yeah, he killed Uriah the Hittite. He had taken Bathsheba, got her pregnant, and then tried to kill Uriah to cover it up and marry Bathsheba. And so Nathan came to him with that kind of rebuke. And Psalm 52 is his psalm of penitence. Psalm 54, when he's in the wilderness of Ziph, the Ziphites tell on him to Saul. He's hiding with us. Psalm 56, a Mitcham of David, when the Philistines capture him in Gath. That would be the same context as before, where he plays the madman. And then Psalm 57, when he fled from Saul into the cave, whether that's Adullam or the cave in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Psalm 59, when Saul sent men and they watched the house in order to kill him, and Michal let him down a window, let him escape. And then Psalm 60, when he fought against Mesopotamia and Syria of Zobah, and Joab returned and killed 12,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt. We read of that in 2 Samuel 8 and 1 Chronicles 18. Psalm 63, when he was in the wilderness of Judah. That's what we just studied in our sermon, where Gad told him to go to Judah, and he left the stronghold of Adullam. And then Psalm 142, we can read of either it's the cave of Adullam or En-Gedi as well, because it's a psalm about him when he's in the cave. All right, and we'll look at some of those in a little more detail. David had two great periods of trouble, and what were they? They're up there. When you think about David and all, you read Psalms of David, they can be pretty encouraging and at the same time troubling. Like, wow, he went through a lot. What did he go through? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You have one, and it's interesting how it's kind of divided. Problems that came upon David because he was faithful, and there was a wicked man after him. And the problems that came upon David because of his sin. And that's a lesson in and of itself to learn about, because while some of these Psalms certainly recall trouble that David is having, and he's appealing to God for mercy and for watching out for him, and at the present moment he's righteous, the things he's going through may have been because of his decisions in the past. And so God's still faithful to us. He's still merciful for us, but that doesn't mean that He'll take away all the calamity we've brought upon ourselves necessarily. So why did Saul pursue him so much? And I know that we've talked about it already, but why was Saul so hateful toward David and intent on killing him? He's jealous of him. David slayed his 10,000, Saul his 1,000. That's really all it was. He was just jealous of him. He was angry and jealous because of the spreading fame of David. But let's think about that second great period where he's fleeing from his son Absalom, who's usurped the throne. And we might be inclined to think, well, David was just dealt a bad hand. What really happened? What are the events that led up to this? What happened in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12? You remember? It's an obvious one. David's great fault. Notorious for this. Yeah, he got Bathsheba pregnant. First of all, he's being negligent. Everyone else was out to war, and he was wandering around on his top of his house. He sees her, lusts after her, inquires for her, lays with her, impregnates her, and then tries to get Uriah to go into her. But he's loyal, and it's a time of war. He's not going to do that to his men and to the king. So then he has him killed on the front line. And Nathan says, "You are the man." What did God tell him through Nathan would happen because of this? Just in general. Say that again? Yeah, the child will die, certainly, and that happened. But then something that would extend, too. Sword won't depart from your house. Within your own house, there will be that kind of trouble. And then we read about some pretty terrible, terrible things. David had a son, Amnon, and he had a half-sister, Tamar, and really was attracted to her and actually forced her and took her that way. And then Absalom hated Amnon for that because he did that to his sister. Certainly we would feel that kind of indignation, but that's from that start kind of part of the consequences of David's sin. There's ungodliness in his house of that sort. And then what does Absalom do to Amnon? He murders him, doesn't he? And that's where he flees. So now you've got a daughter that's defiled. You've got a son that's been killed by your other son. And then the son that killed him you still love, but now he's nowhere to be found. And so there's all that problem. He's convinced to bring Absalom back. And then Absalom's not a godly man and conspires to take the throne. So all that trouble stems from his sin. Consequences of his sin. And so he's still a man after God's own heart. He didn't exhibit that when he sinned, but he continued to repent and when it was needed, and he continued to maintain faith. And that's what the Psalms reflect for us. Two great periods of turmoil in David's life. We read about that some as well in the early days. We got a couple of minutes, so I think we can get through this next section. And so how David came about and the kind of things that he had to put up with early on. In 1 Samuel 13, Saul is king of Israel, and there are the Philistines about him, and there was a certain period of time that he was to wait for Samuel to come make a sacrifice. Samuel wasn't showing up, so Saul acted impetuously, and he made a sacrifice which was unlawful. And that's when Samuel told him, God has sought for him a man after his own heart. You're not going to be the king anymore. You fast forward to chapter 15, Saul fails to utterly destroy the Amalekites. He says, listen, I spared some sheep and stuff, but I did it to sacrifice to the Lord. And that's when Samuel says, you're ignorant of even who the Lord is. He doesn't delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices. He wants your faithfulness. He wants your obedience, because everything else is just like idolatry and wickedness. And so he's prideful, he's arrogant, he doesn't understand God, he's rejected from being king. That's reiterated. And in chapter 16 is when Samuel is sent to anoint one of Jesse's household. And in chapter 16 and verse 7, this was the instruction that Samuel is given, which is very telling, because when the people requested a king, God said, this is the kind of man that it's going to be. This is the typical king. He's going to be arrogant. He's going to tax you. There's going to be oppression, all that kind of stuff. They still chose him, but now it's God's turn. And in verse 7 of 1 Samuel 16, he tells Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as a man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." This will be the man after God's own heart. So David is anointed king, and all his brethren are passed over, and that's where he gets into the court of Saul eventually, when the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, and he's given a distressing spirit. Now David's there, and he's going to eventually take the throne. He's been anointed. Saul's already been told the kingdom will be taken from him. God is providentially providing for that. He's bringing him into power, and Saul resents him for it. A man anointed of God, and that's where a lot of his trouble comes in his days of exile that we'll study about, Lord willing, on Wednesday. We're going to get to more specific study of Psalms Wednesday, so thank you for your patience in this kind of preparation lesson. Again, I'd encourage you to read 1 and 2 Samuel. If you can find the time, it'll be most helpful.